if you want to introduce yourselves to, in this case, our recording, but also to the other two folks on the call, that'd be great.
My name is Ashanti Williams. I am co-founder of the Backyard Farm Collective. I'm a farmer based in Washington County, New York, and I'm originally from the Bronx, New York.
And I'm Arian Rivera, also co-founder, co-owner of the Backyard Farm Collective. I'm originally from Camden, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia. I lived in and around New York City for the last 15 years.
Nice. New York City. So for our first question, we'll go with, how did you both gravitate towards agriculture?
I was moved towards agriculture because my parents are from the South originally, and they grew up growing their own food and raising their own animals. So they brought some of that to the city with them. So through way of urban ag, almost, yeah, through way of urban ag and through like the work of my parents, I was introduced into agriculture.
You're not telling more than that.
Why?
Ashanti's grandfather has this beautiful, what's it, half acre?
It's 3/4 of an acre.
3/4 acre garden in the Bronx, and the hybrid section of the Bronx. And it's amazing. But they grow fruit trees and all types of vegetables. And it's a really Takwa community farm.
Yeah, so it's a community garden actually. So while there are aspects of like tree growing and like larger quantities of growth of food and stuff, there's still individual plots. So different members of the community also grow their own thing. So we have folks from a bunch of different cultures growing stuff. So people from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, like they grow stuff that are like native to their homes and things like that there. A lot of Caribbean people, a lot of Southern people. But yeah.
And I was working office jobs, looking for something to do. I got introduced to this 2-year urban agriculture certificate program. And a lot of the work in that program was done in Ashanti's family's community garden. So that was kind of my intro to urban ag. But then when we started working with livestock, I got introduced to rural agriculture and decided that I wanted to try to do it on a rural scale. But for me, I think ag was very peaceful and healing. And it was like the opposite of a lot of my day-to-day experiences, like getting on the train, going to work, being crowded all the time. I like being able to put my hands in the dirt and think about other things. So for me, I feel like it was kind of a activity of like healing and liberation.
Definitely. You just made me jealous because, well, in 17 days, I'll be on the farm in Puerto Rico, but I'm missing so much, right? Like you said, that peacefulness is extremely important. Just as a second addendum to that question, so was land access an issue as you were thinking about this project, also working in the Bronx and all these different sites?
Absolutely. A large component of our farming is livestock farming, and you need a certain amount of acreage to kind of do that. The animals need a lot of space to move around. And coming from the city, so I was introduced to vegetable agriculture, growing annual vegetables, but I was really passionate about livestock. And like part of why I had to transition, or I felt like I had to transition to rural farming, is because it's like really hard to keep livestock beyond chicken and bees in the city. So, and
then I think the whole other component of land access is like housing access and housing security. And that's always been an issue for me. Like as a non-native New Yorker, I'm in awe of how y'all make it work, but I've always had like unstable housing. And I don't know if land is like the basis of all movements and all like social justice movements. Like folks need to have secure housing and know that there is a place. And so I think a lot of my work has also revolved around trying to have pathways so that folks can be back and forth between urban areas and rural areas, but like to have safe green spaces, but also have housing in those spaces, just because there's always been, like, especially in New York, this speculative commodified housing market. Like when you see other people come to New York from other places, like they got somewhere to go back to. And that feels like a luxury, but it shouldn't be. Like it should be a right. Folks should be able to if they choose. So for me, land access has a lot revolved around like how do Black and brown folks occupy some of these rural spaces? So we can also talk about like political impact. So we could also just talk about like culturally, like having places that feel comfortable for us outside of cities.
And then one last, and I'll pass it on to Tiame. The name Blackyard Farmers, why? What's the reasoning behind it?
It was just like a little play on words. Like we were brainstorming as a team when there was like a bigger group of us, trying to figure out like what we wanted to be called. And we had a lot of different ideas, but I think Blackyard was like what stuck to us. And because our project is so heavily based on Blackness, or like centering Blackness, like we thought it was cool, instead of being like a backyard, it's the Blackyard. So
and then like something we joke about is like, my kids grew up watching the Backyardigans, and it's like we're the Blackyardigans, and we're not, but it's still, it's like it's fun. But this is our extended yard, and we want it to be the yard for our community too.
Thank you. Yeah, man. Oh, you.
I love that. When I was younger, I watched the Backyardigans every Saturday because I didn't have cable. So I guess in the spirit of like, what was life a while ago? Where were you in life before caring for the farmland that you now steward?
Like immediately before this project, I was working at a tech job in Brooklyn at the Navy Yard. But that was always with the goal of like acquiring enough resources to buy some land and farm. But the pandemic just accelerated everything. It made things really crazy. Like lockdown was really challenging for me. I didn't have a great housing situation. So I think it felt like a good time to take the leap. But when I'm not doing agriculture, I moonlight as an IT person.
and for me, like just before we started this project, I was finishing up, or I had just left an apprenticeship with the organization Glenwood. I made my transition to rural farming in 2017. So I hadn't been in the city since January of 2017. And I've been farming on different locations since then, just trying to acquire enough knowledge to kind of do my own thing. So I was on a hazelnut chestnut research farm in Minnesota for a year, and actually came back to New York State in 2019. And was working on like a larger scale CSA farm type operation. And before that, when I was in the city, I was working at Trader Joe's. So food has always been like a part of my life.
And yeah, 2016 through 2018, I was on a pretty large beef cattle farm in Orange County, New York. So we had like 300 head of cattle, and they grazed on about 1,000 acres.
Wow, so it sounds like you were able to collect different tactical knowledge to get where you are. It wasn't just a instantaneous, I'm gonna put all my smoothie in one jar kind of thing.
No, and I think it's really important to have experience in other places before you kind of settle down to do your own thing. Because I feel like there are like a million different ways to farm. And I think having the experience with other people or on other farms, like kind of helps you hone in on like what you want to do and how you want to do it.
And yeah, every farm is managed differently. And I feel like there's no right way as long as it works in that context, in that setting. But if you don't have that exposure, like I think a lot of people get out into the rural spaces and it's so different, their urban ag, that it can be overwhelming. So for me, it was really helpful to get jobs working as a farm manager or a farm hand on other people's farms and kind of learn while being paid an hourly wage, so that when it's time to operate our own business, I have a good idea of what works for me and what doesn't work, or at least some experience so I could figure it out a little easier here. Because even with that experience, like stuff still doesn't work sometimes, but that's part of the process.
Thank you. Is there anything else you would like to say? Because I'm gonna.
I was gonna say, like, I think being like, I know that there's like a lot of statistics around like the amount of like Black farmers, but like I think having the experience of being in agriculture and in rural agriculture and seeing that like firsthand and seeing how things are being taught, like really it made it important for me, like as I moved in this journey, to mix spaces where they were talking about like our culture and like how Black folks fit into agriculture and like, yeah, where we stand.
When I got into this back in 2010, like there was the Black farmer social justice movement, and then there was the larger small farms movement, and they were two very different spaces. And like a lot of these conferences that I used to go to would be like all white. And then if you would try to bring up social justice or food justice, like I had people tell me like, this isn't the space for that. There's other organizations that do that work. And so it's interesting to see, 10 years later, how a lot of it has converged. And I think there is a lot more focus on intersectionality, but back then there wasn't. And it's positive, but I'm still a little cynical of it sometimes, because I think certain organizations and groups do it just because it brings in more money. But if they're doing good work and it benefits everybody, I guess it's a positive.
Thank you for sharing that very authentic experience. We would love to have you come and talk at Red Hook Farms with us. This is a wonderful story. So I'm gonna pass it on to Simone. Thank
I
you,
kind
though.
of want to linger on the comment you had made around the kind of separation between the Black kind of social justice focus and small scale farmers. I'm curious about what are the kind of topics that helps that you see that convergence over the years that you may have observed, and what are kind of some of the challenges that keep those two kind of movements separate from your observation?
Rural white people are like, not all of them, because I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but like they just be very stubborn and resistant to other people's perspectives. So like even out here, there's so many Blue Lives Matter and back the blue flags, and then they'll be nice to you. Like when you sit down and talk to them, they'll be decent. But it's like, do you know that that symbol represents the killing of unarmed Black people? Like, do you get it? And they don't. So even when you go to these conferences, they just be, so, oh, we're not open to talk about that. We just want to talk about the soil. We just want to talk about the animals. We just want to talk about the science and practice of farming. But it's like, it's all integrated, especially when you start talking about food access. So I think more young people coming into this space, like they tend to be more progressive and more open-minded. So that's something positive I've observed. And then I think some of these older white guys like getting called out on their BS. But a couple people who were like, what do you call that? They were put up on a pedestal, and then people started calling them on their stuff. And I think that now we're making space for other voices. But at least when I was getting into things, it seemed like there was just a lot of middle-aged white men taking up a whole lot of space, and they got to kind of drive their agenda.
And I feel like because a lot of the small scale farm movement is, like Arian was saying, there's a lot of young people involved in it. There is like different perspectives, and I feel like them having like the experience of struggling as like a small scale farmer as opposed to a large scale farmer kind of gives them a little bit of insight of what it's like as people to like come into a space and not have like the same access. So I think that there's a little bit of intersectionality there. And it makes it a little bit easier to kind of have the conversations around like race and those different things within our agricultural systems. But
to add on that though, like the inherited farms versus the, like Ashanti saying, the entry into farming. I think when those folks got to see like what struggle looks like, they're like, oh shoot, you've been doing this the whole time. And so I think
in addition to like dealing with like the racial issues in this country, so it's just like, yeah.
Okay.
That's a good. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Tiamat. Go ahead.
I was wondering if this experience that you were having, was it the transition to rural farming, or was it even when you were learning your apprenticeship here in the city? Because there's still some shared experiences that happen in those two spaces. But I wanted to ask, like, was this apparent when you started to be in rural farming, in a space where there wasn't as much access to land for Black people.
So just I think a lot in the way that we're even taught about agriculture. So like it starts from those city institutions and things like that. It's like when you're taught about agriculture, it's usually through like a white lens, and like these are what like white people are doing, and like these are the different techniques, and it's all like it's like a lot of like what we learn in school. It's like a lot of it is through like a white lens. So I feel like learning about it and books and stuff like that, and doing it on a smaller scale in the city was like challenging. And like there were like some hints at it, but I feel like once you get into the rural spaces, like the culture shock and just like physically being in a different environment and not seeing like representation, yeah, shows.
To your point, like I think that Western reductionism of like splitting stuff down into individual silos and teaching it that way, like that's very prevalent in agricultural education. But in my program, like we were a very BIPOC centered certificate program, so I didn't have any issues there. But Karen Washington is one of my mentors, and something she used to point out was like the amount of resources that white-led organizations like Grow NYC, who still employ and work with tons of BIPOC folks, but up until recently, like the management of those organizations was largely predominantly white. And then the farmers that they chose to lift up tended to be those multi-generational, you know, we've been in the Hudson Valley for a long time farms. So when you would go to the green markets, like that would be the majority of the farms there, because they're the only ones who could afford to be there, because you got to be at a certain scale to be in those spaces. And so she pointed out a lot of those things to me, and she was a huge advocate for Arian go be present in these rural spaces. She wrote me a recommendation to get into the Stone Barn Center. And then when I got there, I was the only Black person, except for a lot of the Dominican folks who worked in the kitchen or as servers at the 5-star restaurant that we never got to eat at, even though we grew food for that place. And it was just really interesting because they didn't want to talk about it.
What about your curriculum though? Like the books and stuff that they recommended?
Oh yeah, it's like Elliot Coleman, and Joel Salatin, and these are the old white guys I'm talking about. And they don't want to talk about it. And those used to be the people who would get invited to the conferences. And then I remember being in conferences and hearing keynote speakers say stuff like, we're the tastemakers and we tell people what they like. And eventually it trickles down to everybody else, and standing up and be like, no, that's wrong. Like stuff should be from the bottom up. Like we're progressive, we're here for the people. And it was a big deal then. But then a couple of years later, that same conference invites Leah Penniman to be the keynote speaker. So they got it. It just took them a little while.
I think what's interesting in what you're speaking to right now around the concentration of white folks within leadership positions, such as at Grow NYC, along with your experience at Stone Barns, and then going back to what you had mentioned around your interest in housing security, is it speaks to a larger kind of issue of food apartheid. And I'm interested to hear more about your experiences and how you've come to understand food apartheid and how that's kind of evolved throughout your journey in farming, and then maybe how it's kind of informed the way that you have approached your mission and your work.
Yeah, so I grew up in an area in the Bronx. I'm from the hybrid section. There was like literally like the access to fresh stuff was, or fresh fruits and vegetables was just like really limited. The grocery stores that were there, like the food was very subpar, if anything at all. So I think a big part of why my parents and family started the community garden was so that we could have that access. And even getting to like my preteen, like being able to start the farmers market, the youth-owned farmers market that we did, has always been like ingrained in me to be like giving back to the community and making sure that like we're creating spaces where we're able to provide for ourselves, but it's also like our community. And I think that has always like stayed with me throughout my journey throughout agriculture. And then starting this project, it's been really important and hard and challenging, I guess, to kind of continue to provide for the community as well as provide for myself. And then also like realizing that like centering ourselves and making sure that we're doing well so that we can provide like the same nutrients and the same experiences for members of our community has been really important. But because we live in this capitalistic society, it's really hard to
We can't give it away.
yeah, and I don't think that like this year, I think we did a good job with like figuring out ways to have the food kind of be subsidized so that our communities are still having the same access to things. But I think that there like it definitely has to happen on like a federal level because there's already so much like the gap between the finances between like big scale farms and just like Black farmers in general is just so large as opposed to like the white folks or larger scale farms. So being able to support ourselves as members of those communities and be able to give back to those communities has been hard.
I think like I got to see redlining. I lived in the 150s, you know, Harlem, Washington Heights. My kids still live there. And it's been interesting to see in the 15 years just how much gentrification has changed the neighborhood. And I remember there were a lot more like family-owned small groceries. And you know, some of them had decent produce, but some of them didn't. But now, like every place got a remake and they got produce and they have a wide variety of things. But there's also like a Starbucks at, you know, Presbyterian now, and like everywhere up the block is restaurants and food and just all these things that weren't there before. And so I got a buddy who lived his whole life in that neighborhood, and he's like, I love gentrification. He's like, this shit is good for the neighborhood. Like, we got stuff now, you know, people don't get robbed walking down the street anymore. Like, I can go to nice restaurants and not have to go all the way downtown. And me as an outsider, I'm like, no, this is terrible. Like this inflating housing costs, and you know, it's less of us here than it used to be. So I have mixed feelings around it, but as it applies to us supplying food to the community, you ask in these questions about scale, but like we'll never be at a scale as an individual farm to be able to feed a city block in New York City. And then if we were able to, or even what we can produce now, like the price gap, Ashanti had made this point, like it's significant between what we have to sell stuff for and what they could get it for from Associated or, you know, one of the other grocery stores. So I feel like the work we're doing, if we're not supported by other community organizations, and like this year, we got a lot of support from churches. Like we sold a lot of product to churches. But if not for them, like we end up selling stuff to affluent people because those are the only people who can afford the real cost of food. And I still wrestle with that because I don't feel great about it. Even at the last farm I worked at, like that's who I was selling to in the Union Square Market was like affluent white folks who could afford to pay what I was charging for a cut of beef or a cut of lamb. And I didn't feel good about it. So now we're working with the churches and they pay the full price. But like if we were selling direct to consumer, it's still going to be, even if they are BIPOC folks, they're going to be affluent because they can afford it.
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a point of mine to make sure that people from the communities that I'm from are able to have access to this food, even if it's like we have to figure out how to subsidize it ourselves. And that's kind of like what we've been trying to do. But yeah, it's like impossible. And I don't think the goal is ever to be like the only farm, like providing all the food for for New York City or any of these like places close to us. It's like, I think the goal is to have a bunch of like small farms working together and like, so we're still able to have like a diversified farm, but also having enough quantity to provide like local food. So just having like a hyper local food system, essentially.
And like finding a way to own the retail outlets, but we need, you know, BIPOC owned grocery stores. Like we need an abundance of them, so that they're not competing with the big boys, but that just becomes the thought, like for people in the community, the first place you go to get food is from somebody who looks like you.
But also providing the things that you're used to and making sure that like you're being represented in that space. Like you get to decide what's in your grocery store.
But folks
And
I
it's
know,
better for the environment.
and
But
like us too, like we go to Trader Joe's when we can because it's relatively cheap and they got a wide variety of stuff. So like I don't know how we address that in the longer term. Like
well, I think it is like opening grocery stores and like having markets that are supplied by the people who actually live in those communities or who come from those communities, so that
but I brought up Trader Joe's specifically because like I know they're vertically integrated the whole way. Like they own the entire means of production, distribution, and then final retail.
yeah, and that's why they're
Um,
able to have. There's no middleman in that system, so they're able to provide their stuff at cheaper costs.
But that's those capitalist pushes.
But it's
And
also like an inherent wealth. Like they have a certain amount of money, so they can do that. Like we're coming from a place where we've been disenfranchised like our whole lives. Our people come from that, and not yeah.
but like we've talked about it a lot. We formed our business as a cooperative. Originally there were more members. Now there's two, but we plan to grow back out and incorporate more members. But to be a cooperative of cooperatives, to Ashanti's point, so that then we can start to use our collective power to supply more food to folks.
And it's not like one person, yeah, like doing everything. It's like, yeah, a bunch of different people doing different things, providing enough quantity for the masses.
Yeah, we agree on that. A lot of times we dream about it. I don't know, like in our lifetime, but it is great to see how much more BIPOC representation there is in agriculture. So one of these days.
I apologize. I want to hop on that note because I noticed, even as someone that was that is super interested in fashion. This is a side topic, but like how I got into food specifically. Food has always been in my life. However, fashion helped me think, where does my food come from? Because of the materials that had to be used for fashion. When I started to get into fashion and food, I stopped seeing people that looked like me and darker. So I was wondering what on earth is happening. When I was younger, I was taught there's certain ways to make clothes or there's certain ways to grow food. So when I like immersed myself into these spaces, I thought this was odd because these weren't the people that taught me what I know right now. And in my neighborhood specifically of Red Hook, I see the changes over time, and that there's now leasing towards specific major companies like Amazon, which is warehouses. They're able to store large quantities of food and then utilize their services to provide to those who can afford that food at that price. And when you were sharing about having like the cooperative in the cooperative, what I imagined is possibly having a space that refrigerates food for a long time. However, even doing that, and I've noticed when we have our produce on the farm, the model of farm to table, like directly from farm to table, you have more nutrition versus the refrigeration. And I also noticed that if you do not, even with other vegetables, not just the farm that I work at, like if you do not clean your vegetables properly, they don't survive for a very long time. And then to your point, that it would be wonderful even in this lifetime to have as many people that look like us to be a part of this kind of work, because then it's not just one person saying to themselves, well, we could take all this produce, this waste, and create it into this idea. And everybody on the team will be like, oh my gosh, just like, oh, let's do it. But then there's not enough people. So my question was, have you ever thought of an idea where you created a program that helped urban youth in urban agriculture matriculate into rural farming, and there could be a dual relationship as you're thinking about the cooperative within the cooperative? Because the youth, I mean, I'm grateful that I got introduced to this when I was younger, because I would have been like a fish in a giant pond and been Like, I don't see myself in this, like what's going on. And I have the privilege, like it is a privilege that the people that I work with are BIPOCs.
Mhm.
And like farm school comes and I get to see more BIPOC. But that's not a story that everybody gets to have literally in their backyard. So I was wondering around centering youth, is there a way for like youth to matriculate from small scale farms even to the introduction of rural farms?
Yes, I mean, we host school groups. We had a school group come out a week ago.
2 weeks ago now.
2 weeks ago?
Yeah,
Okay.
2 Saturdays ago.
But that's a big part of what we want to do. The matriculation being one aspect of it, but then just also the representation, like them seeing us creates the possibility in their head, like that it's something they can aspire to. But it takes yes, and yes, but we need so much more support. And then something I want to express like frustration about, even though I think it might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion.
Do it.
Go ahead.
No, but
Yeah.
like you mentioned farm school specifically, and it's like I still think we need to find a balance between the storytelling and the dream weaving and the possibilities and the boots on the ground practical aspects of getting up and doing a hard job every day. When it's cold outside, when it's hot outside, when it's wet outside, when you sit, them animals need to be taken care of. Those plants need to be weeded, watered, all of it harvested, washed, packed, and it's hard. And I love, I look forward when we get to a place where we have so many supports built in place that we can take better care of ourselves and not have to go so hard all the time, but we do. And there's a romanticization that goes on in a lot of these training programs, and folks aren't ready to like take the leap to come out here because this is just hard. And you come, and it's alienating, and you're surrounded by people who don't really care for you or want you to be here or trying to figure out why you're here. And that can be really overwhelming. It was overwhelming to me in my first couple of rural farming experiences. I worked with a group of people last year, and it was really overwhelming for them to be fish out of water in these rural spaces. And so I think to your question, we need to do a better job of preparing people to be out here, or like scaling up urban ag and be like, we're gonna stay here. But I think it's very important to not like overly romanticize farming. And I think a lot of that is happening right now. I'm concerned about it.
I want to speak back to what you were mentioning earlier around cooperatives, because you kind of stepped into an area of interest of mine. I had just finished reading Monica White's Freedom Farmers about the history of agricultural resistance for Black cooperative farms. And what was really interesting is how did different organizations at points in the supply chain help create kind of this collective power that they didn't have by themselves. And that book was mostly focused on the South and then Detroit. And I'm curious to hear about your circumstances being in the East Coast outside of New York. What are the different types of positions within the supply chain or even outside of it do you think need to happen for you in order to get to that kind of goal you were talking around, where you're supplying for Black-owned grocery stores? What are those different actors? What do you think are the kinds of like things that need to be unlocked for that to happen? And then if you could just speak a little bit more as to why do you think that's important to have cooperatives and to be working together?
This is my jam.
Yeah.
Like I dream about this, but we do livestock. So to have our own trusted processors, but right now you drop an animal off with, again, like you mostly dealing with white folks who you trying to get a read on, you don't know them. And there's a lot of trust involved that they're going to give you back what they're supposed to give you because you don't know them. And they can totally take advantage of you. They can overcharge you. They can steal your meat. It's not going to say they will do it, but they could. So for me, it's like having the value added processors and other components that it takes to take like raw food into processed, shelf stable, or products that could be stored for longer, whether that's pureeing and freezing vegetables, or having commercial kitchens to do minimal prep on stuff and then flash freeze it again so that it could be available for longer time. They're also like cold storage. We need to have cheap and like regionally available cold storage. We just hooked up with our local food bank. What are they called?
Comfort food community.
The comfort food community, who serves this 100% white rural area. But like we got introduced and we told them like we need more freezer space because we're about to process the rest of our turkeys, and it cost us $1,500 to buy a freezer. We already own 2 of them, and we need at least 5 of them to store this many turkeys. And he's like, "Oh yeah, we have cold storage available, and it's $12 for a pallet per week." I'm like, yes. And so they're working with us. Now we're in community with them. They're going to support us. But like having that cold storage available saved us literally thousands of dollars that we get to keep in our pocket. So we don't have to make more investments in infrastructure. And then the biggest thing for me is distribution. Like I've driven to New York City 3 times in the past 7 days, and it takes me 4 hours each way. So 8 hours of driving, 24 hours of driving in the last 6, 7 days, delivering turkeys, delivering chickens, and it's rough. Like I could do it, but I don't know how long I can do it. Because I'm farming too.
And it takes away, having to do everything. It's like that whole idea of having to do everything, having to grow all the food, having to distribute all the food, having to do as like 1 or 2 people, or even as like a group of 10 people is like a lot. So like just in terms of talking about cooperative, like kind of spreading out the labor amongst different groups of people so that we can take care of ourselves and it is sustainable.
And hopefully too, like we like to sell at retail because we make more money that way. But we understand that to work with distributors, we need to sell at wholesale. So then it's like finding distributors who understand what we're dealing with and are giving us the best deals possible, and like buying at the highest price possible, even if it does mean they'll make a little bit less money. And I don't know how that works. I don't know how we subsidize that, but there are BIPOC folks who have distribution companies, but if they can only buy from us at wholesale, I'm gonna get my butt in the truck and I'm gonna drive the 8 hours to get all of my money because we need it right now.
But
So,
if we, as I say, if we were to develop a cooperative system where that was like one component of the cooperative, so we found like someone who's going to distribute the stuff and at this price, because we know that like the farmers need to make this much money, but like at a price that would be affordable for them, like that would be like the goal.
And so maybe collectively owning the truck and then cooperatively coming up with the salaries for the driver among 4, 5, 6 farms, and then that becomes doable, right? Something else that I talk a lot about, we raise small ruminants, so during the winter we have to keep them alive, which means feeding out hay. And hay is a huge business, but the like barriers to entry to cut your own hay is hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment. And then you got to buy hay from people who, again, you don't trust, who are always trying to get over on you. And like they see me in Ashanti, and they're like, "Oh, they must have money. They come from New York City. Like, why else would somebody come up here and live this hard life unless they got money?" So they charge us too much. They price gouge us. And so like the shared equipment and infrastructure to harvest and store hay, also like to process chickens. Like it would be great instead of all of us have to buy the same $5,000-$6,000 worth of chicken processing equipment, and we could collectively own it. And then you sign up on a Google Calendar. This weekend you get to use it. This weekend you get to use it. But those are things like I'm actually working with a couple of folks who writing some grants on, and we're trying to get some money to make that happen, because it doesn't make sense for us all to like reinvent the wheel when we could share that wheel and just roll it around.
Yeah, that is something that I've even seen like happen over here. We don't utilize large scale equipment. We do everything by hand. And if it really wasn't for the community or for like the dedicated 6 workers, like the 2.5 acres that we have here just wouldn't be able to survive at all. And I didn't know that that there's a difference in such a difference in experience between rural farmers and urban agricultural farmers because of how remote the areas are and like what trust looks like establishing trust where I'm from, that still was not easy because it's like that romanticization you were sharing before. People want to get into farming. They want to go and get some followers on TikTok and social media, but they're really not there for the love. They're
Or
not
the
there
labor.
or the labor. I remember when I first was like really getting into this, into farming, one of my now friends literally shared a similar sentiment. This is not easy work when it comes to the winter time.
Mhm.
So I thought to myself, well, what would it look like in the wintertime? What can my body take on? And those aren't conversations that are like people can have. For me, I had to change my whole food diet to be able to have that amount of energy to do any of that physical labor.
Yep.
And it's like, it for me, it's like it begins with youth, because if they don't have those foundations of nutrition, of health, how does food get to where it is? Like, there's a huge gap. And as we're speaking, I'm trying to imagine, like, the gap looks like distribution. One of the major gaps looks like distribution, and then storing that equipment so that it's accessible to whoever is in that coalition. Because from what I've noticed in this community specifically, like, that are BIPOC and farmers, a community is very necessary. It can't just be done by yourself.
Mhm.
And it's like, how do we even create that trust amongst one another, let alone trying to sell that food or create that relationship with somebody that just so happens to have been established maybe 30 years and had the capital to have this lot, like this supermarket. Is like, it's a question that my friends and I that are in farming like try and grapple. Like, what is trust would even look like for us? We come from similar experiences, and we know what it felt like to have trust and that get taken away. So it's like, I love this idea of cooperative, and I'm really appreciative for Simone, like making us pull out some more details of what that would look like. Still, I can't help but to say, like, that it's romanticized. Even like, what would like, if we were to really be radically true to one another, how could we create that after? Because there's going to be like some hurt things said. There's going to be things of like, I've dealt with this person, like this with this person. And it's bringing those on, like, how much honesty can be brought to the group, where it's like, you know what, we were this truthful. Let's write a grant and let's see what happens. It's strange. Sorry, I apologize.
No, but I think, like, to that point too, like, we are not all amazing people. Like, we might be, but people got skeletons, people got dirt, people have flaws, people have shortcomings. And something I realized in my 12 years in this work, like, a lot of hurt people are drawn to farming for whatever reason, especially rural farming though. Like, it is isolating, but a lot of us just want to be left the heck alone. Like, and that's cool. And something I struggle with is, like, I've encountered enough successful rural farmers of all colors to realize that, like, that stereotype of kind of the ornery, standoffish, like, loner type, like, it's kind of legit. Like, that's who a lot of us are. And not that we choose to be, just that's what our traumas and life experience has made us. It doesn't mean that some of us don't strive to be more than that. It doesn't mean that we don't need community, but there's a place for us in community too. And, like, people not disposable in spite of their shortcomings. Like, this is healing work, and we all approach it from different experiences and different backgrounds. But I'm out here because this is where I feel most comfortable. Like, this is where I feel good. And you could judge me if you want, but I'm not going to lose too much sleep over it, because I know that this is good for me, and I know it's good for a lot of other folks. And something like that really, I feel like there's whole sections of the population that aren't even being given exposure or opportunity to do this. But, like, when I worked at the Navy Yard, or when I worked at Hunts Point, and, like, I'm working with electricians, and I'm working with mechanics, and I'm working with construction laborers, like, those people are the most ready to boots on the ground go start farming, because they know how to do stuff. but we ain't trying to talk to them like, oh, they toxic or they patriarchy. And it's like, they are. So how do we heal them? How do we bring them in closer, hug them, and be like, take this shovel and let that out. Like, get that out. But for me, like, that really resonates with me because it can't be exclusionary. Like, we can't be self-righteous, especially if we're talking about feeding whole communities. Like, it takes a lot of people of a lot of different stripes and backgrounds and skills. And yeah, that's part of a conversation I would love to have. Like, tell me where that's happening.
Yeah.
Sean, would you like to say?
I was gonna say, yeah, because there's already so many gaps like within our current communities that don't address issues that we have that I feel like are kind of swept under the rug. And yeah, it transitions into like the work of farming. It's like there aren't examples of like healthy ways to hold folks accountable. Like it just is what it is. And like I think part of being a human is like making mistakes and not being like perfect. So it's like, how do you like how are we creating those spaces where that is accepted, and like how are we setting up spaces for folks to be healed and to be held accountable for harm and all those things like that. It's just
Yeah.
How would you imagine it, the two of you? Like, you don't have to romanticize it, but it's like, I mean, for me, when I apologize, Simone, it just feels really good to finally see other people. And like when I was my beginnings of when I was coming to a place where I was like, this is where I'm going to put my hands. Just genuinely. It wasn't exactly the smoothest transition because I literally was coming from years of trauma, like community, physically, emotionally, spirit. It was just, I came to a point where it was like, I don't know how to make friends. I don't know how to work, and I don't know how to be an effective team member in general. And then I was like, the only place that I know that helped me when I was younger was when I used to take care of our parcela in Puerto Rico. And that was the loner place. Like, this is where I'm gonna be. If you want to see me, I'm chilling with the chicken, right? Or or like the dog is with me and we're like herding up the animals. That was where I was at. And I was thinking to myself, like, where can I find that? And where would be a safe space where that can be? But I came into the place with a lot of like hurt. And then also like they found out I was a scientist. So that was like a level of like, no, we really do not trust you. Even though like you look like us, but like we don't trust you because you are a scientist. And I was like, okay, so then how do I like gain trust? And it's not an overnight thing. And that healing process isn't an overnight thing. So when I see people, even like newcomers and cliques getting built, like in the community level, because we are a community-based farm, sometimes I'm like, find myself running away. And the people that I established very close relationships will be like, T, I see you running away. Like, what's happening? And I'm like, this is a trauma trigger. This is happening. Like, I haven't seen a healthy community like this. And like people are still coming and it's making me it's frightening me. People want to have conversation. They want to bring their friends and more people come. But it's like, it's not easy when you are that loner where it's like, I finally found this one place where everybody can leave me the heck alone. But then when you start growing and healing, like people start getting attracted to that. And like, that's where my question came from. Like, it seems like the two of you are in a place where it's like, you can do youth development. And it would look like possibly you've done this kind of thing in urban settings. Now, like, here's the rural setting. This is where another kind of healing can take place. And I was just like wondering if the transportation and the distribution would be a part of like, how do you get people to actually be a part of this experience, here, and even in your own grant writing of like your cooperative, like how do you teach maybe like youth how to drive that are from New York? Because most of us that are born and raised here, we don't have no license,
No, I had to learn.
Creative idea of like, maybe you could bring in your grant writing of like creating community, because I can tell you, I will not fall asleep in a car with somebody that I don't trust.
Mhm.
And I'll be snooze, like put me in a car, I'm like a baby. I'm like, I guess that was just the lightheartedness that I wanted to bring, but like, it is like where the conversation, the programs for like our people to like heal, because people that don't look like me are benefiting from the place that like me and my people are like creating and for each other, like our own womb. You know, we're taking the sticks and putting it for one another, but it's like other people are literally benefiting from that don't look the way that I do or darker. And it's like, it's that benefit that's very strange.
Yeah, it's like a level of exploitation almost. It's hard. It's because like those things don't exist, so we have to create those things. And I think, yeah, so like you said, like learning how to drive, right? I didn't get my license until like 2017 in the fall. Like I was probably 26, 27. I didn't know how to drive, but like, and even like after getting my license, like it wasn't like I got my license and I was like, oh, I'm comfortable driving. Like you got to be comfortable. These people have been driving since they were 16, 15. So it's like, yeah, having somebody who's gone through that be like someone who is creating a program where it's like, you know, this is part of like, so we're gonna probably do like apprenticeship programs, right? And folks will come up here and be able to live. But maybe like a precursor to that could be like, you know, there's driving classes that are like, this is how you get your license and this is how you drive. And like, you know, if you learn how to drive in New York City, then you can drive anywhere. But like having like a cooperative that focuses on that, right?
And on the representation piece, like for me, I know so much of my journey into this rural space was like trying to find elder mentorship. And that could have been Caribbean Black folks, that could have been from the continent Black folks, that could have been from down south, but I couldn't and I didn't. And it's funny because I knew Ashanti's grandfather and father, but I just really started getting to know them well in these last 2 years. And like I finally did find that elder mentorship. But when you talk about the youth, like it's important for the youth to see themselves reflected in the people who are teaching them.
Mhm.
So like something I'm a huge advocate for is, again, like we can't have communities that are only represented by certain genders or certain races or certain complexions of certain races. Like we need the whole spectrum.
And it's, I want to acknowledge it's hard because there aren't a lot of us up here. Like Simone mentioned something about freedom farmers. It's like a lot of that is happening in itself. So like there are Black people in the north, and there are some folks doing stuff up here, but it's not a lot. So it's like, and because like we aren't like necessarily a collective where everyone's working together, like we don't really have those organizations and stuff established where we can kind of borrow from one another, or, you know, oh, like you want to learn about fiber, like go down to these farms, or there's like a listserv of like, these are the people who are doing these things. It's like, we're not like together as, I feel like, yeah, we're not a collective as folks of color farming up in the north either. And I think like that could probably be like a huge start, like plugging into like a thing that represents all of us so that we can share our resources.
I mean, and we should plug, like we're members of a couple organizations, Black
Yeah, but
Farmers
that's
United,
very,
New York State,
it's very isolated.
Northeast
Yeah.
Farmers of Color. But even with that, like we're still really geographically dispersed. So the logistics of like getting to other people's places and still getting home in time to do chores becomes complicated.
I guess one last kind of thing I want to talk about is, what do you think food sovereignty looks like for this region and area? And then as I think about that, I just want to kind of focus on one of the things that I think that you're doing interesting locally is you mentioned partnership with churches. I think that's really interesting considering I used to live in Harlem. I lived there for several years, and I think it has some of the most churches per capita in the US. So that's a sign that you're doing something around what does food sovereignty and food work look like at a local level that is appropriate for the people that you're servicing. So what are some of the other aspects of what kind of people you need to be working with, what kind of steps need to be taken to get to food sovereignty. And I guess, what does food sovereignty look like to you? Because I'm sure everybody has a different answer.
I mean, to me, food sovereignty looks like being represented and having like my needs met as like a Black person.
And for me, like, it means a more regional economy and a more like seasonal diet, but it also incorporates like Pan-Africanism, and like we're all over the world. So we should be trading with each other as opposed to like these middlemen and people who are exploiting the resources of Africa and the Caribbean and the global South, like finding ways that we're in control of those relationships. Because like I know people want to eat plantains, you know, people want to eat yuca. And I'm not saying they shouldn't, but like let's make sure we're buying it from the farmers who grew it. So for me, food sovereignty feels like building those connections and pathways and controlling them, as opposed to like being at the whim of these commodity markets, of these multinationals that like go into people's homes and countries and exploit them. Food sovereignty means like having a say in what you get to eat, but also like not being extorted on the production side or on the retail side.
Were there any questions on the list that you thought were particularly interesting that you want to be able to answer before we go today?
Yeah. The one about environmental pressures that push us towards certain practices that feel antithetical to our values. Black plastic. Like, black plastic is great. We used it last year. You don't have no weeds. It keeps moisture in the soil, but it's plastic and it's terrible and it's bad for the environment and it's wasteful. So we didn't use it this year. We had a ton of weeds and the soil got dry, especially because we had a drought this year. But it's one of those things. I think organic agriculture is using more and more plastic every single year. And it's like spiraling out of control.
It's
and nobody talks about it.
And I think, yeah, people also don't talk about like how long it takes to get to a point where you don't need Black plastic, or like, because everything is so like quick, everybody wants this like instant gratification. Like farming is an instant gratification, and like people are doing things to kind of make it that way. And I feel like it's terrible for the environment. Like if we were growing on this land for 5 years and like we had kept our weed beds, weed seeds down, like we wouldn't have to worry about weeding as much and like worrying about like the crops doing things. Like we'd be able to rotate, we'd be able to cover crop, all those different things that like provide vibrant, healthy plants. But it's like, you know, you go in your first year, it's gonna be rough. Like, and it's just like you have to have patience and the privilege to be able to be patient to grow the amount of food that we need to grow. And it's like everything is like, well, we need this much money because we got to pay rent, or like, you know, we can't be here, we got to buy this farm. How are we going to buy the farm if we don't make the money? And it's like, yeah, a terrible cycle that you get stuck in.
The next one, some institutional barriers we've encountered, like access to capital, part of that being tied up with, they give mad money to nonprofits. So there's pressure to become a nonprofit, but we don't want to be a nonprofit. Like the nonprofit industrial complex is a whole problem. And if we are going to be in this capitalist society, like we need to figure out how to do business and not be all nonprofits. It's cool to be down with nonprofits. Like we have fiscal conduits who are nonprofits, but it feels like in this whole Black farmer space, there's a lot of pressure to be a nonprofit or to create your own nonprofit. And what I'm noticing, like people will create a nonprofit and a for-profit, and the nonprofit buys stuff from the for-profit so that they can subsidize buying stuff at full price. But that's overly complicated. Like, why are we doing that? And why is USDA and all these other organizations like more inclined to give money to nonprofits as opposed to giving it to small farms? You want to add on?
No. Right. That was pretty accurate.
All right. Yeah, we talked about trans-regional alliances. Yeah, so I guess that's a lot of it. But then like the Black farms in the US, like the new communities down in, I think it was in Albany, Georgia, where Shirley Sherrod and the Reverend Sherrod, like they inspired me. Like I got to hear them come talk when I was in farm school 10 years ago. And like, that's it. Like what they did, you know, buying, I think it was 5,000 acres and trying to build housing and schools and a church. Like that is the dream, because it'd be great to have our own little villages and towns and not be isolated to this extent. But I'm also aware, like, when Black folks have built nice things in this country, they come and burn it down. So I guess there's a downside to that too. But still, like, that is something I aspire to, because it takes more than just farmers. Like, you need all of the community supports. You know, you need, like, for me, I want to see my kids more often. And like, their mom is like, there's no way in heck I'm letting them go to school up there in that 99.4% white community that you live in. So like, feeling like community is able to support us up here more, and then having like redundancy and resiliency built in, so like me and Ashanti could take the winters off. But right now we can't, because it's only two of us. But like, we'd like to get to that point. And we are actually going to try something this year where I step back for a few months. And then hopefully if she's able to, she'll step back. But just so that we don't burn out, because I have burnt out before and I really want to avoid that this time around.
I do have one left.
Pushes
go ahead.
towards growth and scale. It's just like last year we raised 300 chickens.
4?
Nah. This year we raised 500
We
chickens.
did 400 chickens.
Last year we did like 50 turkeys. This year we did 100 turkeys. We don't want to be just a meat farm, but like, meat is our most profitable enterprise right now. We realize like the complications that come with buying grain and how much water it takes to grow the grain, that it then takes to feed the animals. But that's our most profitable enterprise right now. So like, we going hard on poultry. But we don't want to, and we know that we should probably stop scaling up at some point, because the land can only handle so much.
Also, yeah, there's a max number.
And we're nowhere near that max, but still, like, that's already in the back of our head. It's like, there it is. There's capitalism being like, raise more turkeys, and us being like, yeah, but we don't want no more blood on our hands. Like, that's enough turkeys. Let's grow some vegetables. But the vegetables aren't as profitable for us. So.
Yeah.
That's such a fascinating tension, the tension around scaling up the poultry business. It's the most profitable, but the land can only handle so much. It really makes you rethink every time you eat a turkey or a chicken. I guess I just want to be conscious of time. The last question I have, my interest area is around how kind of the work we do, the people we associate, the way that we produce food affects the way that we taste it and the way we think about it. I'm curious, how has your work changed your relationship to the way you eat and the way you think about food? One of the things you mentioned was seasonality, but do things taste different? I know for me, I worked in with a food manufacturing company, and once I learned about a lot of the issues regarding respect for the labor force, food that seems like it did not respect its labor force seems to not taste as good. So I'm curious about your thoughts around your relationship to food and how things taste and how you like to make things.
Yeah, so before I transitioned to rural farming, I had already kind of been like looking at food different, because like we were raising chickens at the community garden. I think that's the biggest livestock we were able to have there. So even like buying eggs from the grocery store was just like, it just tastes empty to me. Like after like harvesting and going to get the eggs from like the chicken coop, it's just like I stopped buying eggs. And then it was like, well, I know I want to work with small ruminants, or just ruminants in general. So I'm gonna try to not eat any food or any meat from like that's like mass produced. Like I'll get it from a local place. And my family is Muslim, so it was like, I'm gonna only eat halal local meat. And it was fine, like, you know, like when you're just like one person like feeding yourself. But then I started thinking about it like on a scale, like if it was a whole family, like how expensive that would be. And I just remember like before I moved up here, just being like, all right, I'm taking $50 a month and I'm buying all the meat that I can afford with that. And that's the meat that I'm gonna eat for the month, because like I don't want to contribute to having cows being fed grain and like large scale. Like I don't want to be eating like chickens from confined places. Like that's not what I'm about. And like now, like it hasn't been super sustainable because it is expensive. And I feel like I did a good job at like being able to only eat meat from like local places. at most of the farms that I've been at. But yeah, then it got to a point which is very weird to me too, where I was like living in rural spaces and being like, I want local like grass-fed beef, and then they didn't have it. And it was just like, but we're in farm country. Like there's all these cows around here. So like where's the meat going? So like just coming into that conundrum. But yeah.
This Thanksgiving was like really special because it was the most stuff on the table that I had ever produced before. But like we had squash and carrots, and like me and my daughter went out early Thanksgiving morning and we harvested the rosemary and the sage
Collard greens.
and the collard greens, and like we had raised the turkey, and so it definitely tasted different because I could taste like my own love that I had put into it.
Yeah.
And then I was about to tear up for a second. I feel like every time like you eat something fresh out the field, like that's special. Knowing that you cultivated it. But one of my things for a long time has been like animal processing. Like I've worked as a butcher, I've worked in different slaughter facilities. I trained Ashanti in poultry processing, and now she's really good at it. But we started this practice where now we pray every time. And like we even took it a step further this year, and we started like making our own little like holy water and putting herbs and flowers in the bath, and then like washing the chicken's heads and washing their feet before we slaughter them. And it's just it's so messed up that you got people in warehouses who just kill animals all day, every day, 300 and however many days a year. And like that's a profession, right? And we don't care about those people. And typically those people are like migrants who are being taken advantage of and exploited. And I don't want to eat that. So like right now I'm eating about as clean as I ever have. Like we rarely eat stuff. Every time Ashanti's like, yo, I'm gonna get some chicken breast. I'm like, no, we're gonna go home and thaw out the chicken and I'll cut the breast off for you. But I think like for the larger society, oh yeah, then a little anecdote. So my son was with us, was it last summer? But I was like, yo, you gotta help process the chickens. And he's like, nah, Dad, I don't wanna do it. I was like, listen, we really need help. I need you to come process the chickens. He's like, Dad, I can't do it. I'm gonna go vegetarian, but I can't. I was like, if you don't do it, you can't eat no meat. And he was like, well, I'm not gonna eat no meat then. And he went vegetarian. It only lasted for a couple of weeks, but you know, that was his choice. But I feel like if consumers were faced with that choice, like go get blood on your hands just once, and then see how you feel. Maybe you'll eat a little less. Maybe you'll be more mindful or more thoughtful around how much protein you consume. So, yeah. And you had asked us about churches. Like churches are community organizations, and like people in church have faith. And I don't necessarily agree with all the tenets or all the different congregations or all the sects, but like people of faith make stuff happen. And you gotta have faith in something to be out here farming, like you do. And you gotta have faith in something to try to build a system or to like deconstruct the current one and make it more equitable and just. So like I'm down with people of faith, and that could be people of the Muslim faith, people of the Hebrew faith, people of the Christian faith, but like just generally people of faith, like they show up and they put their money and their values where their mouth is. So it's been really good working with them, and I hope that can become a more significant part of our business.
Ryan, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Ryan just came back from a conference that involves religion.
Yeah, I was at the Academy of Religious Studies or whichever. But I mean, they're struggling with these things as well, these conversations, right? How to include it in their own processes, how to expand it within their own congregations and everything else. So it's a step forward, at least, that they are thinking about these things. We're trying to engage with folks who are doing that work, and trying to rethink, again, their own processes and their own connections to the natural world, because they've been disconnected for so long because of religious practices and because of religious theology and such, right? So this is, I think, to me, heartening that folks are thinking about this in multiple spaces, right? There's still a lot to do, but it's a start, right? So when I heard you mention that, the churches had been sort of the main supporter over this year, I think that to me was great, right? To hear that, see that participation, because again, there's so much power in those spaces, right? In terms of the audience that they have, that if you can get them included in that process, a lot of folks will turn towards that process, right?
Yeah.
And they can buy farms too. Like a lot of them have the means. So like long term, you know, churches can feed their own congregations.
Well, again, I want to respect your time. I know that we only asked for an hour of your time and we took a little bit longer. Again, I want to thank you for this opportunity to chat with you. And I know, well, I'll leave Simone and Tiame themselves, but I thank you for this opportunity. I wanted it to be in person, but for many reasons, right, it was a little difficult to do that. But we'll put this together. We'll send you the recording as well, so you can have it for your records. And I'm going to try to get someone else to maybe edit it down a little bit so we can make something a little more presentable. And we'll go from there. But I look forward to at some point visiting you upstate and seeing the project and everything else, and getting my hands dirty. I've killed chickens. I've never killed a turkey or anything else. So to learn that process as well. Like you said, I think that if folks have that opportunity, like I learned from my grandmother, right? And she was like, oh, this is nothing. She'd taken like wine its head and I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing? But that's how you learn, right? In practice itself, right? And that's how I've learned everything that I know in life. So I appreciate those perspectives and those stories that you shared with us.
Thank you for having us, Ryan. It's been great.
And I know you probably heard enough from us, but let us know, like on one of those Monday evenings, because again, things are quiet now, so we might be able to pop in if you did still want to do a Q&A at the end of one of the classes or something. And I just want to like acknowledge like all of y'all for the work that you're doing, because I think we really have to approach some of these systemic problems from a lot of different directions. And I have so much respect for the time and effort you have to put in to get PhDs and do grad work and go to school and write papers and all of that. But I know that helps impact change also. So just like really appreciative of y'all approaching it from that angle and supporting us while we do some of the work down here on the ground. And y'all welcome to come visit anytime.
I was just about to ask. I want to build that solidarity because I would love to come visit sometime.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe
probably
we can do a field trip.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do a field trip.
We had a few tour buses come through this season. Well, a school bus and a tour bus. So we got parking.
Got parking, and we're gonna try to open up agritourism next year. So we might have some tents too. So
yeah, we want to do some overnights. Potentially, like we did a farm to table with an overnight this year. So we try to do a few of them next year.
Tiame, you have anything you want to add before we?
I feel excited about the ideas that came to my mind. I'm definitely thinking about I go to my old high school regardless as a mentor, and I want to share with them like that I met y'all and tell them that I think that they should meet you too. That's what I look forward to doing this week.
wow, that's great.
You have a beautiful community farm down there. I've been there a few times. It's amazing. Y'all do great work.
You're more than welcome to come. I mean, really, if I didn't start it, I'm grateful somebody else did, because but you're more than welcome, literally. If you let me know, then I can set together a fire and get some s'mores because it's a little cold outside. And I'll get some stuff and we could just put it on the grill.
You bring the meat, we'll bring veggies.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much.
Got anything you want to add before we let these folks go?
Just no, thank you so much. I love seeing all of this coming to life. I've been writing and thinking about Black farming agricultural cooperatives, and it's nice to see people doing on the ground, and just the urge to collaborate and feed each other seems to run thick within the community, and I love seeing that come to life. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank y'all
Thank
for
y'all
having
for
us.
having us.
Thank you again. Thank you for your time, and I'll keep in contact with you about the other stuff as well.
Okay.
And
All right.
if you're ever making a run to the city and actually gonna be in Brooklyn, let me know.
Yeah, for sure.
We will.
All
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.